Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different because over last weekend I went to an armored tournament. It wasn't exactly the typical HEMA Harness Vectin tournament that you might see on YouTube otherwise. It was actually something a little bit special. It was an armor as worn kind of half armor tournament. And what I mean by that is that normally when you go to a HEMA Harness Vectin tournament, everyone has to have full kit, it has to be kind of dated within a certain range, and the rules are pretty well pre-established. But in this particular tournament, what we had instead was a rule set where people could wear whatever they wanted armor-wise, of course, but they could also substitute armor for HEMA stuff. They could put on a HEMA mask, they could put on shin guards and stuff like that. And the reason for that was because the purpose of this tournament was to get people into armor if they weren't already in too deep. If you look at my kit, you can pretty easily guess that it costs quite a lot. And it's a lot to ask for people to spend a whole bunch of money on armor when they've never actually tried the fighting before. So this kind of tournament is a perfect opportunity for people to try out armored fencing without having to spend all their money. You can buy pretty garbage breastplates off of, costume shops because at the end of the day, they're going to be okay. And then put the HEMA armor on for everything else and just basically treat them like they're an armored knight. You can see here on my opponent, he's got, the Wakuski mask. We're treating that as a full helmet. He's got the breastplate on. That's pretty cheap. He's got his shin guards on. So those are basically the exact same thing as being armored. And I have to go for the exact same targets as I would normally go for on someone who is wearing armor like me. I'm wearing my full helmet, I've got my pauldrons on, I've got my cuirass on, and the only places people can really stab me are in all the little bits of red gambeson that are showing through, same as essentially my opponent. So we get to have a nice little armored fight without having the other person to have spent $4,000 on a suit of their own. So we're going to be breaking this down exchange by exchange like I always do, but I'm going to be taking a lot of opportunity to also talk about the rules of the tournament in each exchange because it might be a little bit confusing when you're watching this, not necessarily knowing how it works. So this first exchange is actually a pretty great example of one of the things that is both good and a little iffy about a half armor tournament like this, and that is one in which you're allowed to score cuts to unarmored areas. Now, obviously, normally, if I was really putting on my full kit, I'd have my chainmail voiders on there, which I tried to put on but didn't actually fit during the day. I think mostly because I didn't have my wife who normally helps me put my armor on. And in this particular instance, my opponent lands a nice little undercut right to my armpit, and they end up giving him the point for that. Now, obviously, again, if you hit chainmail, not going to count. But for the purposes of this tournament, it makes a lot of sense to allow something like this because most of the other people at this tournament are not going to be wearing their full kit like I am. And at the end of the day, you still want them to be able to fence somewhat like they're used to in the world of Blossvect and HEMA, but not quite to the same extent when it comes to targeting. So really nice cut, really good selection. Definitely a 1 in a million shot, and he definitely deserved to get that point for that. Again, despite the fact that maybe under other circumstances, it wouldn't have counted based on what I was wearing. Now, the second exchange is a long one, and one that I'm particularly proud of, but the first thing we have to talk about here are ring outs. Now, ring outs were a thing in this tournament, but as you can see, based on the exchange, they weren't being very tight about it. And the reason for that is that, as you can probably guess, armored fighting is very grapple heavy, and grapple fighting can take up a lot more space than normal HEMA really can. So there are several instances where during this fight, we end up outside the ring, and my opponent and I just kind of had like a standing unwritten rule that whenever that happened, we'd kind of help each other back into the center of the ring so that we can continue the fight rather than having it end every single time I, who's got an extra 80 pounds of armor on my body, would accidentally shove him out of the ring and then we'd have to reset. Thankfully, that is what happened because once we return to the ring, we get to continue our little grapple exchange and I end up getting a really nice throw. Now, one of the things that I was trying to focus on when I was doing this tournament was I really wanted to make sure that I really tried to go for a lot of throws. And that's because throws were allowed here. There are a lot of tournaments, HEMA Harness Vectin tournaments specifically also, where throws are not allowed. Even Boo Hurt duels often don't allow throws. And I'm not really 100% sure why that is. I think it adds a really nice angle to the game. But at the same time, there are maybe some, venue reasons or just excitement reasons that they don't allow it. And in this particular instance, the reason I get this throw off is that I get a really nice hold of my opponent. one of the things that happens when you're grappling with longswords is that the longsword itself can be used as kind of like a hockey stick to check people away. The problem is that you have a danger end of the stick and you have basically a somewhat useless end of the stick. In this particular instance, my opponent starts to roll their sword from their right to their left, and in so doing, they put the not so dangerous end of the stick towards my face, which is of no threat to me. At the exact same time as this happens, I kind of disconnect my hands a little bit. I go for this underhook under their right arm. I do end up getting it, but what really cinches the deal is that I get the simultaneous overhook on both their sword and their head with my right arm. I can only really do this by disconnecting my arms and then trying to do the old boo hurt sword behind the back head pull down idea. That's really what I was going for here, and I ended up getting this really nice underhook as well as a direct consequence of the position my opponent had put themselves in. So from that position, it's a very simple step to the left and a little roll of the hip, and he goes down nice and easy. And one other thing that I want to point out is that while throws can be somewhat easier in armor due to the way that the center of balance is pushed on people, at the same time, they can also be really hard to execute without falling down. And this is a really critical aspect because if you look at any manual or really go through any rule set, being able to throw someone without falling down yourself makes things significantly harder. And as a general ideal, you want people to be able to go for things that are significantly harder and be rewarded for it, rather than necessarily just allowing any other, exchange where both people fall down on their butts and have to try to clamber back up to be an exchange that you really want to see or really want to encourage point-wise. Now, I've skipped a few exchanges where we end up way too far outside the ring and end up getting stopped for that, but I'm going to cover this one because it's interesting in a couple of ways. One, it's very basic. It's a very simple, just stab to the throat by me in a half-sword position, but what's also interesting about it, I think, is that it highlights one of the reasons why you half-sword in armored tournaments overall. And it's not just the fact that, it allows you to use your weapon to kind of maybe theoretically penetrate armor or get yourself a little bit more accuracy in thrust so that you can really hit those specific gaps. It's also the fact that it utilizes the fact that you have a lot of non-scoring targets available, and it also highlights why more traditional tactics that you might use in Bloss-affected HEMA really kind of get thrown out the window the second you're no longer able to hit people in certain places. So when you're watching this exchange, I basically just trudge forward with my hands almost sitting vertical in front of my body with my half sword at the ready, and all I'm doing is kind of just fishing for parries and binds with my left hand and that little dagger's worth of sword sticking out past my left hand. The reason I'm doing this is because I really just flat out don't care if he hits me in the side of the head, the neck, the arm, anywhere. Anything that he can hit right now is basically off target for me unless he manages to get a 1 in a million shot into my hip crease. And the reason this is a good idea is because when you're wearing armor, one of the best tactics you can use is to just trust that your armor is going to keep you safe. Allow yourself the kind of headspace to just go in, tank a hit or two, and then get something really good of your own. And the reason it works out for you is that a lot of times armor is worn to be positioned in a certain way so that it covers a lot of your gaps. I'm wearing Milanese plate, which, if you don't know or do know, often overemphasizes the left side of your body for this specific reason, so that I can walk forward with my left leg and my left arm forward in front of me, and basically you can't see the gap in my armpit anymore. There's nothing really in my elbow pit anymore because my arm is bent. My neck isn't really open. Nothing's really open. So I can just walk forward, wait for my opponent to make a mistake in the sense that they hit me somewhere they can't really hit me, and then capitalize on it by just going for that stab straight to the throat. It works out because at the end of the day, everyone's so used to trying to snipe at gaps with their hands on both at the bottom of the sword that they end up basically putting themselves in a bad position in which they can't actually defend the attack that I'm really going to throw. So next up, we have another fun little grapple exchange, but one that doesn't end in an exciting throw. It just ends in another stab to the arm. And this highlights another thing that I actually talked about in a previous video about my sometimes misgivings with the Gladatoria style throw setups. And that has a lot to do with the fact that when you're really going for armored throws, it actually behooves you very nicely to disconnect your arms and just go for like classic wrestling style throws. When you read the Gladatoria, a lot of what it tries to tell you is to do throws both with the sword in both of your hands and with the sword overall. And sometimes that can work, and I think sometimes it cannot work. But this is one of the really great examples of both the pros and the cons of disconnecting your hands in this specific kind of long sword I can stab / throw scenario. So In this particular exchange, we get kind of bound up. I bum rush my opponent. We get outside the ring again. We end up walking up back toward the ring a little bit. And when that happens, my opponent, who has an underhook on my right side this time, tries to go for a little bit of a throw, can't quite get my base of support out of the way, at which point I try to seize this opportunity, take a little bit of a step in with my left leg and go for an inside reap takedown. And I don't get it. And one of the reasons I don't get it is particularly because when you're wearing armor, you have a lot more weight on you, and it becomes a lot more difficult to throw those typical judo style leg tosses. And the reason they're so hard is because A, your leg just weighs like 5-6 pounds more than you're used to. And also two, that extra weight on your body now has to be supported by one leg, and trying to go up on one leg when you're just yourself and you're trying to throw another person is already hard enough. But doing it when you also have an extra 60 pounds or 80 pounds on you means that, you're putting a lot of risk on your knees, and it can often feel like you're about to throw yourself more than you're about to throw your opponent. So it doesn't end up working out. Now, after this failed throw, we have another little disconnect, and we have a situation here where both of us are basically in the exact same kind of position. We're both in a position where we don't ever actually have control of the other person's dominant hand, which happens to have a sword in it. And instead, what we're doing is we're trying to use our non-dominant hand to get a nice little stab up into the armpit of the offside. So we both have our left arms extended out, trying to stop the other person from getting in and doing something else. And we both expose that same armpit, and we both go for the same stab. My opponent is just the one who happens to get the much better one, and I end up missing a couple times. So why is this important? Well, as I mentioned earlier in the Gladatoria, it often tells you to keep your hands together on the blade. And I think this might be one of the really core reasons why. When you disconnect your hands, you do offer yourself up a lot of great leverage points and great opportunities to throw really nice throws. However, you also put yourself in a position where when your hands are disconnected from the sword, one of them is going to be up, and that is going to expose the armpit. And as I learned from doing this tournament, the armpit is probably the quintessential spot to be cut or thrusted in any situation where you're doing an armor as worn style tournament. The armpit is probably the biggest area of space in the most convenient spot, and as a result, any situation in which you expose it is probably giving your opponent more of an opportunity than you would maybe think. As a result, I think that there's maybe a little bit of credence now to the kind of tactics that you see in the Gladatoria, because if it is all about not exposing your armpits, I can certainly understand why it would be worth sometimes sacrificing a really great opportunity for a really traditional wrestling style throw if it means that you really, really, really don't want to get shanked in the armpit as a result. So here we're going to have our final exchange, but one thing I cut out was the massive break that I had to take. And this brings up an opportunity to talk about rule set again, because in most HEMA Harness Fechten tournaments, they do not do continuous fencing. They do exchanges, just like we're doing here. You'll go in, you'll get a point, you'll reset. And it was my impression coming into this that being able to take a break after every single exchange was basically a way of making sure that people didn't gas out too badly. And I think that's still probably true. However, one of the maybe mistakes of this tournament is that we would go to 7 exchanges, which is a pretty decent amount of exchanges, but also that when you would double or when you have a non-conclusive bout because, a ring out or something like that, you'd redo the exchange. And this one went to 10 exchanges, and 10 exchanges is definitely a lot to do while wearing armor the entire time, especially in all these instances where we keep going for these grapples, and throws are just very exhausting. So normally, I'd say that I would really prefer a continuous fencing tournament, and I can see now why that maybe people wouldn't like that. It would be very, very easy to gas out just in the span of 30 seconds or even a minute. However, at the same time, I would also point out that if you are doing a continuous fencing rule set, you can conclude a winner at the end of 30 seconds or even a minute or even 2 minutes, where in this instance, I have to do 10 exchanges that each last about 20 to 30 seconds, and I'm completely fucking dead by the end of it. I've essentially done almost 3 or 4 minutes of full actual fencing, and that's just too much for me to take. So on the one hand, we can talk about how a rule set should always take into account whether or not someone can feasibly win in a given amount of time. Normally in HEMA with Blossfechten, that's only because we want to make sure that fights just don't take too long because we got to do like 1,000 of them a day. But in armored fighting, maybe we should consider the rule set as an expression of how long we think people can actually reasonably fight in their armor for however long amount of time before they're so dead that they can't really function anymore. Maybe that's just because my cardio is bad, but if you do think that, I promise you, put on like a 60-pound weight vest and try to run a mile and you will fucking die. So at the end of the day, there's definitely some things that I'd like to change about the rule set here. Maybe one-handed stabs with the thrust. Maybe just in longsword shouldn't be counted quite as much. Maybe there's some other things that could happen. Maybe we should limit the exchanges somewhat. I don't know. But what I do think is that this event went really well. It got a lot of people interested in armored fighting who maybe weren't before. We got to see other people who brought in their own armor and got to fight in it sometimes for the first time. And as always, it's an opportunity anytime you fight in your armor to learn new things about your kit and to start making adjustments so that things will work better next time. I'd certainly learned that I put a little bit of perf plate in my visor slit so I wouldn't get stabbed in the face, and never once got even stabbed towards the head because most people who were fencing me just understood that like there was no chance they had of even reaching it on purpose. At the same time though, my neck was maybe a little bit more exposed than I really wanted it to be, and while I did have a chainmail collar underneath of there, I just don't think that's fully sufficient. I might try something a little bit different later on where I try to wear my bishop's mantle outside of my breastplate. A, so that it's more visibly there, and B, so that I can come up with an attachment system to put it on kind of like the bottom of my helmet. That way it does a little bit of a better job of protecting my neck, where normally it sits underneath and gets kind of scrunched in with the bottom of the helmet and the top of the breastplate. All adjustments I'll be making for this weekend, where we have Fun Fect again, and where I may or may not be going over another armored fight this weekend, especially because Icebreaker just happened. But hopefully I'll get a lot more armor time this weekend again, and hopefully I'll have some more video of that in the future.